Hello everyone. Today we're talking about a figure I probably love way more than the average person. And that is Edward VIII. He is such a misunderstood figure. So many people only know him as the traitor king or as a Nazi, which, let me be clear, he was neither of. Anyway, I'll try to give you some of the good things about him so that you can have a broader picture. I'm not going to tell you what to think of him, no way. But I think if I can give people some good parts that you might not learn in your Year 9 history class, then you can sort of reconcile that with all the bad stuff you've been taught and come to your own conclusions. So, let's go. Edward was born on the 23rd June 1894. He was the great grandson of then Queen Victoria, and was born straight into the direct line of succession. Uh, Funny enough, though, despite this, he seemed not to really have that much awareness of his own constitutional importance in a good way. When World War One broke out, he was super eager to serve, and I mean properly serve. Not do photo ops, not do all this or that. He wanted to be on the front lines with the British soldiers. And when the government, obviously, blocked the heir to throne from serving on the front lines, he got very upset. He even once reportedly said, "What difference does it make if I am killed? The king has three other sons." Pretty upset. Edward would still succeed in getting close, though. He pushed as much as he could to be with his men. He made numerous visits to the front lines, and frontline trenches, and was very well loved by the actual soldiers for this. Something that continued even after the war ended, with him enjoying a lot of popularity from veterans. He also then expanded that popularity after the war by visiting a lot of deprived areas of the UK, breaking a lot of class boundaries and showing, for a time, quite an unusual care for his common subjects. We've got to remember this isn't like the modern monarchy with 21st century photo ops and stuff. For the heir apparent to be visiting these very, very run down, poor, deprived areas was a pretty big deal. It wasn't done on like a routine basis by members of the royal family, especially not someone as senior as the heir apparent. Anyway, eventually Edward began going out on many trips to foreign nations, first on an imperial tour, and then to other nations. One really cool picture I put up is him in this samurai kimono. I only found it on Wikipedia, so there's probably other cool pictures, but yeah, he was traveling a lot. There you go. Through these travels, he'd make a lot of friends. One such friend is Lady Furness, who hosted a lot of parties. At one of these parties, hosted by Lady Furness, Edward would meet Wallace Simpson. You knew we'd have to get to it. Now, the two got on, probably made each other laugh. They fell in love, basically. Standard stuff. Edward was a human, and he loved this lady. So eventually, as you do when you love a lady, he wanted to marry her and make her his wife. Now, he could have just kept her on the side as like a mistress, but Edward didn't want to do that. He wasn't just in it for like lust or hedonism. He genuinely loved her. He clearly had love for her. However, unfortunately for Edward, when he began planning to marry her, he'd also become the center of attention for Britain's elite. Given he'd ascend to the throne after his father's death in 1936, he'd already had a rocky relationship, given that while speaking to his Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, he told him that something must be done about some unemployed Welsh coal miners, which was Edward probably seeing himself as a good king by showing concern for his people, as he'd done all his reign by visiting these deprived areas. Um, However, to the political class, who were not used to monarchs being this involved with like common people and these very poor people, it seemed like Edward breaching political neutrality of the monarch, and so didn't get the relationship off to a very good start. Anyway, this meant going to get him to marry Wallace Simpson. He was already not in the best place with the elites of Britain. Now, the issue with Wallace is not that she was American. That was more of an unofficial thing that they didn't like. What was really the big deal and the big reason why he couldn't marry Wallace was because she had been divorced not once but eventually twice. So Actually, to make it worse, her second divorce wasn't even fully done by 1936, so it could have also been bigamy. Not great. Anyway, it wasn't too much of an issue. Edward could have been fine to wait until the divorce was finalised legally. The big issue was that she was divorced. Once, twice, 50 times, it doesn't matter. The Church of England, at the time, forbade marriage after divorce. Funny enough, nowadays it doesn't show that much concern for marriage after divorce, but back then they took it so seriously that not even the King of England could get around it. Worse than that, he'd be heading the church. The head of the church breaking the rules of that church is definitely not a good look. Edward knew this. He tried his best to solve the issue. What he did was propose a morganatic marriage. Basically, he'd marry Wallis, but Wallis doesn't become queen. She's just a consort with a lesser title. Duchess, princess, that kind of thing. Not queen. And also, none of their kids would become heirs to the throne. So if Edward had any kids with Wallis as king, they would not be legitimate heirs. If this went through, funny enough, it would actually mean that we'd end up with Queen Elizabeth II anyway, because it would have went to Edward's brother, King George VI, and then Elizabeth II. So we ended up probably would have got the same monarch that we had in our timeline if the morganatic marriage went through. But despite Edward's best efforts, this was still seen as unacceptable by the church and the British political class. And in fact, the government said that if he married her in any way, morganatic or not, they would all resign. A government that resigns en masse, with no ability to appoint a Prime Minister who can carry the confidence of the House of Commons, would mean the UK would have essentially no government. As you can imagine, how chaotic and bad that would be, you kind of need a government. With his country's stability being held hostage, Edward decided that his own power was just not worth his people being plunged into chaos, and so he decided to abdicate. That's it. That's the big abdication. I know, right? Not exactly some evil guy abandoning his country. He loved a woman, wanted to marry her, tried to compromise with a lesser marriage. The government threatened to plunge the country into total chaos, and he decided he'd rather abdicate than plunge the country into total chaos. Seems interesting for a quote unquote traitor to do that. Oh well. Anyhow, moving on to the other thing he's hated for. But he's a Nazi, I hear some people saying. Look, no, just no, he was not a Nazi. What you're probably thinking of is the photos that came out showing him meeting with Hitler. Yes, that's true, he met with Hitler. Do you know who else met with Hitler? David Lloyd George met with Hitler. Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler. Meeting with Hitler does not make you a Nazi. You have to understand the actual mood around Britain at the time. Britain had just come out of World War One, a war so bad and horrific it was called the war to end all wars. I'm sure most people have been taught the abject horror that were the conditions of the trenches. But Edward didn't have to be taught it. Remember how I said earlier he went visiting frontline trenches in World War One? That's right, he saw the horrific conditions his people were facing firsthand. In his mind, the last thing he wanted was more young British boys to face those same horrors again. Not only that, but this was during the full swing of the Great Depression, which began in 1929. The UK was simply not ready for a war. We know this because in our timeline we did end up going to war anyway, and we lost our empire, lost our status as a superpower, and became a junior partner to the Americans in the Cold War. We collapsed so totally after World War II because we were simply not ready to enter. We were in no condition to fight another all-out war. Edward would have known this, just as Chamberlain knew it with appeasement and Lloyd George knew it. Diplomatic overtures and attempts to keep the peace to ensure new trench warfare didn't break out, with young British boys being sent out to die and live brutally, or to prevent the utter collapse of the British state as we have seen happen after World War II, does not make Edward a Nazi. In fact, knowing so much about his patriotism, sense of duty, and unique concern and connection to ordinary and poor Britons, it's no surprise that he'd have tried his best to pacify Hitler and ensure Hitler didn't start a war which the UK would have been dragged into. Most people at the time thought if Hitler could be turned east to fight the Soviets, you could see fascism and communism wipe each other out while Western nations rebuild and strengthen. So whoever, or if any party did emerge victorious, then they'd be easy pickings for the Western powers, like Britain, to ensure they didn't expand or harm Britain's interests. Agree or disagree with Edward, but it's blatantly clear he did not have to be a Nazi to do what he did. There are other reasonable explanations for his actions. Anyway, that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video. I just thought I should rant a little about this since people so often misunderstood Edward, and it really annoys me quite a bit. As well, I wanted you all to keep in mind that this isn't me saying Edward is only good, or that he didn't make any mistakes. Totally not. He was human. Like every figure in history, he had bad aspects. Just to name one to show you I'm aware of it, he wrote a particularly vile and nasty letter to his mother after the death of his little brother, Prince John, which he later had to apologise for. So look, he was no angel, just like nobody in history is an angel. But I do think he is extremely over-villainized, and in truth, was probably quite a heart-driven leader who genuinely cared a lot about his people, including uniquely much about the common and poor people of his kingdom for the time with British aristocrats, and could have made a better king than most people probably think, even if he wasn't as passive and well-behaved as the monarchs we did get, given his emotional attachment and passion for his people.